Hello, welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto. Today we're talking about whether or not your lug nuts are swollen. And David Pearson passed away recently. I had an opportunity to speak to him, so I'm going to talk a little bit about him at the end of the video and the podcast. So if you're a NASCAR fan, stick around, or if you don't care about the lug nuts but you do about David Pearson, fast forward to the end. Today we're talking about swollen lug nuts, and that is a phrase I never imagined I'd be saying out loud, swollen lug nuts. And a gentleman called me today and he said, Steve, have you heard about this weird thing with the Ford lug nuts? And that perked my ears up because, as many of you know, I drive a Ford Explorer. So whenever I hear about a problem with Ford, I'm always curious. Number one, will it affect me? Luckily, in this case, no. But second of all, I hate to hear about car companies doing stupid things. And it's become a topic of conversation lately because we always hear about these car companies that cut corners in attempts to save a couple pennies per car and do something really stupid. Or occasionally they'll put something on the road that wasn't ready for the marketplace, like the dual clutch transmission. So when this guy called me and said, Steve, have you heard about the swollen lug nuts? I thought he was joking. How can a lug nut swell? For those of you who don't know, the tires on your car are part of a wheel assembly, and the wheel, the tire gets mounted on the rim, and that wheel assembly goes onto your car and is held in place with lug nuts, okay? So if you ever see somebody changing a tire, you jack the car up, and then you have to remove these nuts to get the wheel off, and so on and so forth. Those are lug nuts, okay? I know 99% of my audience knows that, but just in case. Lug nuts are what hold the wheel on your car. So lug nut technology, as you might expect, was probably refined and perfected about 110 years ago. I mean, it's one of those things. I'm joking. I'm talking about automotive lug nut technology. I suspect they use lug nuts to bolt wheels onto horse-drawn carriages. I mean, but the idea that something's got to hold the wheels onto the spinning assembly, okay? I mean, this shouldn't be that complicated. And so when someone called me and said, Steve, did you hear about the swollen lug nuts? Again, it sounds like such a non sequitur. I'm like, what are you talking about? And as he described it to me, I typed the phrase into the Google, and up pops rafts and rafts of articles about Ford and its swollen lug nuts. So some of you may have heard of this. I apologize. I just heard about it for the first time today. But Ford is now using a two-piece lug nut on the wheels of millions of Ford vehicles, and those lug nuts can become swollen and nearly impossible to remove with a standard lug wrench. Now, this is according to a lawsuit filed recently by a law firm called Hagen's Berman, and they are a notorious class action lawsuit firm that sues car companies over widespread defects. And they're onto something here because it looks like this is a big problem. And all you got to do is just run a search for the phrase swollen lug nuts, or find somebody who's got one of these cars and say, hey, have you ever tried to take your wheels off? Like to maybe rotate tires or possibly change a flat. And so according to the information in the lawsuit, and most of this checks out from what I've seen, but the firm said millions of vehicles from a variety of makes and model years could be affected. The complaint specifically names, however, the Ford Fusion, the Ford Escape, the Flex, the Focus, the F-150, and the F-350, and those are vehicles from the early to the mid-2010s. The problem is described as, instead of having the lug nut being a single piece of fabricated metal, they were instead made with a steel core and a chrome, aluminum, or stainless steel cap, which was designed to match the vehicle's wheels. And this is according to the complaint. So they look really nice. You walk in the showroom and you look at them, and if you can see the lug nuts, they look pretty. But the problem, of course, is that the lug nuts can swell and delaminate after changes in temperature and exposure to moisture. So if you keep your vehicle in a hermetically sealed desert-like atmosphere, you might be fine. If you drive your car on the roadways of America, you might have problems. And in Michigan, where we have temperatures and exposure to moisture, it's going to be a problem across the board. Vehicle owners then have to try and apparently fail to remove the swollen lug nuts with the lug wrench. So here's the thing. The lug has got a cap on it, and the cap apparently can corrode or something can cause corrosion in there, and causes that to swell just enough to where the lug wrench that is in the trunk of the car or wherever you've got your equipment, you bring it out and it won't even go on the lug. In other words, the lug is now too big. So vehicle owners then have to try and fail, and then they then have to replace the lugs, which you can't do by the side of the road if your wrench doesn't fit, and that's a problem. The complaint tells of plaintiffs being stranded with flat tires, taking the vehicles in to be fixed, only to have Ford to refuse to pay for the replaced lug nuts under warranty. And that's the thing is, Ford apparently looks at it and goes, well, gee, if it looks like someone's cranked on that with an ill-fitting lug wrench, you're going to say it's abuse or misuse. And they are apparently not saying that this is a warrantable issue, which is kind of strange. And now, quoting one of the attorneys, he says, we're not talking about breakthrough technology or computerized aspects of the auto world. We're talking about possibly the simplest part of the car, the lug nuts. I would possibly argue that a cup holder is a simpler piece of technology because all a cup holder is a hole with a floor, okay? But I think at this point we are really splitting hairs as to which is a simpler thing, a cup holder or a lug nut. The problem is the lug nut's important, okay? Lug nuts hold the wheel on the car. If you've ever seen a wheel come off of a car and go down the road, you know it's a problem, number one, for anything that wheel hits, but number two, for the three-wheeled vehicle that is not as easy to steer as it used to be. I do remember a few years ago watching one of my heroes, A.J. Foyt, lose a wheel at the Indy 500 and actually managed to negotiate, I believe, 2 turns and a good distance of straightaway and make it into the pits without touching down on the one spindle, which would have screwed things up. But most drivers can't do that, and most drivers also don't have a pit crew waiting for them 3 seconds down the road if they've had a problem of this sort. So Ford did get emailed by the writers of, I believe it was Car and Driver, where I found this article. And they didn't comment because they said, well, we don't comment on pending litigation. And the article I'm quoting is by David Mueller. The title is Swollen Lug Nuts Are Costing Ford Drivers Time and Money, according to the lawsuit. Plaintiffs are seeking individual damages that would be determined in court and claim that these Ford vehicles have lost value, to say the least. They're seeking class action status, and they've got plaintiffs from Arizona, California, Illinois, North Carolina, Ohio, Tennessee, and Virginia. The lawsuit that I'm speaking about was filed in the Eastern District of Michigan Federal Court, and that, of course, is because Ford is headquartered in Dearborn, Michigan. And like I said, the idea of a swollen lug nut never would have occurred to me. But, of course, this is a problem. And I was poking around the internet looking for other mentions of the swollen lug nuts. And I can tell you, they've been cheapening things on cars for years. Even my beloved Ford Explorer came with one of those really, really cheap scissor jacks that's made out of, like, pressed metal. And in, like, a laboratory setting, it'll actually work. But if you're by the side of the road and you do not have a perfectly flat surface and you're trying to use that scissor jack and there's cars going by behind you at 70 miles an hour, and it's cold out, and it's not friendly and possibly raining, good luck with that. So I carry a bottle jack in my truck, specifically because I'm not going to be using that scissors jack unless it's an absolute emergency and I can't actually use my bottle jack for some reason. But the bottle jack is plan A, and the scissors jack is plan C. And I don't even know what plan B would be, but it'd be better than a scissors jack. So with respect to the swollen lug nuts, it seems like an idiotic idea. Probably saved a couple pennies per lug nut and makes the wheels look a tiny little bit better. But again, now this is from a different website called RepairPal.com. The problem description they give is the lug nuts in the Ford Fusion, that's just one example, are known to swell to greater than their original size. When these lug nuts swell, the lug nut wrench will no longer fit, so they must be drilled out or extracted in some other manner. The lug nuts swell when they've been tightened too tight as well, which means that if somebody does manage to get this thing off and put it on wrong, they can also damage it. To prevent the condition, they recommend only tightening lug nuts with a torque wrench, which no one carries on them. I mean, I know what one is. I've used one before, but I don't carry one in my car or truck. If changing a flat on the road, the lugs should be loosened and tightened to specification at the earliest opportunity. But the fun thing about RepairPal.com is they ask people to send in complaints. And here's a gentleman who wrote in and said his 2011 Ford Fusion with only 39,000 miles on it took my car in for an oil change And the place called and said the lug nuts were swollen, and of course they recommended replacing it at a cost of $10 to $12 each, for a cost of $200 to $240 to replace. Another guy with a 2011 Ford Fusion at 55,000 miles wrote, between my parents, my brother, and I, we've owned in excess of 50 plus cars. I've had General Motors vehicles that have driven to 250,000 miles. I've never encountered swollen lug nuts until I owned this Ford Fusion. The service manager told me it was a design defect. 20 lug nuts equals $196. Labor to replace, $238, because they don't just come right off. They don't come when you call them. Total cost, $434.95. Was I ripped off? You tell me what you think. And then finally, 2014 Ford Fusion owner who said warning light on the dash showed low tire pressure. I pulled over and found the driver's side rear tire nearly flat. I removed the tire and jack assembly from the trunk to change it out, and when I tried to loosen the lug nuts, the tool wouldn't fit. I called Ford Roadside Assistance 3 hours ago, and I'm still waiting. So that comment was purportedly posted from a guy sitting on the side of the road with a flat tire that he couldn't fix because his lug nuts were swollen. He then went on the internet, found repairpal.com, and they said, tell us your story. And he told the story in real time. Unfortunately, there's no update, so we don't know how long it took for the customer roadside assistance to get there and save him, but I hope he got the help he needed. So the situation with the swollen lug nuts is real. I'd never heard of it before, and I apologize. I should have heard of this by now, but that's why I love it when people bring this stuff to my attention. So if you've got one of these cars with these really, really pretty lug nuts, you might want to take a look at those and see if they're going to cause you a problem down the road. If you're thinking about buying a car that might have these kind of lug nuts on it, you're going to need to factor in that you may need to spend $200 to $400 to get this whole situation fixed by somebody else if you're not handy and can't do it yourself. So that's the situation with the swollen lug nuts. And as always, if you hear about problems like this, please contact me. Call me, email me, tweet me, whatever it is. Get the information to me, and I'll do a podcast just like this one. Now, it's sad to say, but a couple days ago, David Pearson passed away. David Pearson was a NASCAR driver, one of the best. And when I say that, that is an objectively provable statement, because Richard Petty, of course, is the winningest driver in NASCAR history. David Pearson was number 2. And David Pearson was 83 years old when he passed away recently. 3-time NASCAR champion. He won 105 races. 105 races. And one of the most interesting statistics about David Pearson has to do with Richard Petty. And the two of them were 1-2 in races 63 times. Where if Richard won, David was in second place. If David won, Richard was in first place. And that's an amazing statistic. And even funnier is that in those races, David Pearson won 33 of them. So he won slightly more of the races than Petty did when they were 1-2. But I have to tell you that I can tell you from personal experience, David Pearson was one of the nicest guys on the face of the planet. And I tell you that because I did research on the man who drove this car. This is the model based on Bobby Isaac's K&K Daytona that he raced in 1969 and 1970. And Bobby Isaac passed away in 1977. So I was trying to track down and interview people who knew him. And I met somebody who said, oh, David Pearson was good friends with Bobby Isaac. And Bobby Isaac didn't have a lot of close friends. He was known as being kind of a loner. And somebody said, I can get you his phone number. And I said, well, I'm not going to call a guy because he got his phone number. And they said, no, just call him and tell him why you're calling. He's a nice guy. He'll talk to you. So someone gave me his home phone number, and I called his home one night. And I believe it was his wife who answered, and she said, hello. And I said, hi, I'm trying to get a hold of David Pearson. And she said, oh, may I ask who's calling? And I said, well, my name is Steve Lehto. He does not know me. I'm a writer from Detroit, Michigan. I'm writing about Bobby Isaac, and I'm trying to track down and speak to his friends. And I understand that David was friends with Bobby. And she said, oh, yeah, hang on a second. And I hear, hey, David, guy on the phone wants to talk to you about Bobby Isaac. Next thing I know, David Pearson gets on the phone. Hello, who's this? And I said, hey, Mr. Pearson, my name is Steve Lehto. I'm a writer from Detroit. And he said, oh, my gosh. And I said, well, can I ask you some questions? I go, do you have time now or some other? He goes, no, I got time now. We talked for a couple hours about his friendship with Bobby Isaac. And it was just a fascinating thing because David Pearson didn't drive for Chrysler. So they weren't on the same team. They weren't even on the same side, so to speak. But they were from the same general region, I guess, where NASCAR grew up, and they were in that group of original guys, Petty, Jarrett, who I also interviewed, by the way, Isaac, and Pearson, and they all knew each other. And David Pearson had an airplane at one point in time, and he used to fly himself to races. And he told me, he said, yeah, he goes, once in a while, Bobby and I would fly to a race together. And he goes, it's kind of funny because people would joke about how Bobby Isaac didn't like talking. He goes, oh, when you're alone with him, you knew him, he'd talk. Didn't like talking to strangers or reporters. So, and it was an amazing thing. I mean, I sat and talked to this guy, like I said, for a couple hours. And, answered every question I asked him. Was volunteering stuff, telling me stuff no one had ever heard before, and it was extremely, extremely useful stuff. And at the end of the conversation, I thanked him profusely, and I said, I really appreciate this. He said, well, I'm glad. He goes, I'm glad you're writing about Bobby. Bobby died in '77, and not a lot of people know about him. And he goes, I'm glad that people remember him. And so when I look back on the period of time when I did research for these different projects, when I think about the people I talked to, some of them were some of the nicest people on earth. And these guys are guys who are like national champions in NASCAR. I interviewed Ned Jarrett, same thing, one of the nicest guys around, Richard Petty, interviewed him too, great guy. These guys will sit and talk about this stuff. And I've spoken to guys who write in other fields or other sports, I guess. And nowadays dealing with the egos of the big players in whatever sport it is. And the fact that I called David Pearson at home on a weeknight with no warning and he's got on the phone and talked to me for a couple hours is something I remember. And, I've watched the races that he's been in. I've seen footage of him, and I know the statistics. I've read all about him. And that's one thing. But having spoken to him for a couple hours on the phone was an absolute joy. And so David Pearson, Godspeed. Passed away recently, like I said, age of 83, second most winning driver in NASCAR history with 3 NASCAR championships to his credit. So David Pearson will be missed. Otherwise, as always, questions, comments, feel free to put them in the comments below. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.